The rattle of the wagon wheels was a constant, merciless rhythm against the vast, silent plains. Each jolt sent a tremor through Clara's bones, a physical reminder of the journey's grim purpose. For 3 days, the sun had been a white-hot eye in a cloudless sky, baking the dust until it rose in fine, choking clouds that coated her tongue and settled in the folds of her worn calico dress. She was 19 years old, and she was being sold. Her uncle, Jebediah, sat beside her on the rough-hewn bench. His shoulders slumped in a permanent posture of defeat. The sour scent of cheap whiskey clung to him like a shroud, a smell she had known her entire life. He had not looked her in the eye since they left the shriveled, failed farm that had been her home since her parents had succumbed to fever a decade ago. He had made the deal in town, his voice thick with drink and desperation, and had come back with a pouch of coins heavy enough to seal her fate. "He's a man of means, Clara," he had mumbled, his gaze fixed on the dirt floor of their cabin. "A man of property. You'll want for nothing." He did not speak of kindness, or of character, or of love. He spoke of ledgers and transactions, for that was what this was. She was the last asset he possessed, and he had liquidated her. The wagon crested a low rise, and a structure materialized in the heat-shimmered distance. It was not a grand ranch house, as she might have pictured, but a squat, forbidding building of dark timber, crouched against the earth as if hiding from the sky. A few smaller outbuildings were scattered around it like discarded scraps. As they drew closer, she saw 2 men leaning against a fence post, rifles held loosely in their hands. They watched the wagon's approach with an unnerving stillness. A man emerged from the main house. He was older, perhaps 50, with a barrel chest and a thick, graying beard that could not conceal the cruel set of his jaw. His eyes, small and dark, raked over her, a swift and intrusive appraisal that made her skin crawl. This was Silas. Jebediah pulled the tired horse to a halt. He fumbled with the reins, his hands shaking. "Here she is, Silas." "As agreed." Silas grunted, his gaze still fixed on Clara. He walked around the wagon, his boots crunching in the dried dirt. He stopped beside her and, without a word, reached up and grabbed her arm. His grip was like iron. He pulled her down from the wagon seat, and she stumbled, her thin shoes landing in the dust. He held her fast, turning her slightly as if inspecting livestock. "She's a bit scrawny," Silas said, his voice a low gravel. "But she'll do." He looked at Jebediah, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "Get your coin and be gone." One of the riflemen tossed a heavy leather pouch to her uncle. Jebediah caught it, the sound of the coins clinking together a final, damning toll. He would not look at her. He could not. With a flick of the reins, he turned the wagon around, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Clara watched him go, a hollow ache spreading through her chest. He was the last piece of her old life, and he was abandoning her without a backward glance. The world she knew had just vanished behind that curtain of dust. "Inside," Silas commanded, his grip tightening on her arm as he propelled her toward the house. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud, plunging the room into a dim, stale-smelling gloom. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and something else, something metallic and sharp. There was no woman's touch here. The furniture was heavy and dark. The floors were unswept, and a film of grime covered every surface. This was not a home, it was a cage. Silas shoved her toward a narrow door. "This is your room. You will stay in it unless I say otherwise." He opened it to reveal a small, windowless chamber containing only a thin mattress on a crude frame and a wooden bucket in the corner. "One of my men will be outside your door. Do not try to run. There is nowhere to go." He left, locking the door from the outside. The sound of the bolt sliding home echoed the shutting of a coffin lid. Clara sank onto the mattress, the rough wool scratching her skin. She was property, a thing to be locked away, guarded, and used at the whim of the man who had bought her. The silence of the room was immense, broken only by the frantic beating of her own heart. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. She saw Silas only at mealtimes, when one of his men would unlock her door and escort her to the main room. She ate what was put before her, usually a gray, tasteless stew, while Silas and his men talked in low, crude tones, their laughter like the barking of dogs. Silas never spoke to her directly. He would simply watch her, his gaze possessive and patient, as if he were savoring the fear he knew he was instilling in her. It was a cold, calculated cruelty, and it terrified her more than any threat. She learned to make herself small, to keep her eyes downcast, to become as silent and unobtrusive as the shadows in the corners of the room. Her existence shrank to the four walls of her cell. She was a prisoner, listening to the sounds of the house, trying to piece together the nature of the men who held her captive. She knew they were not ranchers or farmers. She heard them talk of freight wagons and of deals made in border towns, their words laced with a casual violence that chilled her to the bone. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon a week after her arrival. The air was heavy and still, promising a storm. Through the cracks in her door, she heard raised voices from the main room, a sharp escalation from the usual low grumbling. Silas's voice cut through the others, a whip crack of fury. "You lost how much?" he roared. A younger man's voice, trembling, tried to explain. "The axle broke. Silas, we were ambushed on the pass. They took the whole shipment." There was a sickening thud, the sound of flesh and bone meeting a heavy object, followed by a choked gasp of pain. Clara pressed her ear to the door, her body rigid with fear. "You think I care about your excuses?" Silas snarled. "That was my property, my money." Another blow landed, this one followed by a cry that was cut short. Clara could hear the man gasping for air, pleading in a wet, broken voice. She had never heard such sounds. It was the sound of a man being systematically taken apart. The violence was raw, methodical, and utterly without mercy. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clamped over her ears, but she could not block out the terrible noise. She saw, in her mind's eye, what was happening. She saw the rage on Silas's face, the terror in the young man's eyes, the finality of the act. Then a sudden, deathly silence. "Get him out of here," Silas said, his voice strangely calm. "Bury him deep, and let the rest of you remember what happens when you fail me." Clara slid down the door, her back pressed against the rough wood, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. She had witnessed a murder, not in a quick flash of gunfire, but in a slow, brutal beating. The man who had bought her, the man who considered her his property, was a killer, and she knew, with a certainty that froze her soul, that her own life was worth no more to him than that of the man he had just discarded. She was not a wife. She was not even a person. She was a possession, and he would break her or dispose of her with the same chilling indifference. That night, the promised storm broke. The sky, which had been a placid blue all day, turned a bruised purple. The wind began to howl, rattling the very foundations of the house. Rain came down in sheets, drumming against the roof like a frantic heartbeat. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening explosion that seemed to shake the world apart. In the chaos of the storm, she saw her chance. The guards would be focused on the weather, their senses dulled by the roar of the wind and rain. It was a desperate, foolish hope, but it was the only one she had. Terror gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She waited until a particularly loud clap of thunder rattled the windows, and then she threw her shoulder against her door. The old wood groaned. She did it again and again, her desperation fueling the assault. On the fourth try, the bolt, weakened by age and rust, splintered from the frame. The door swung open. The hallway was empty. The main room was lit by a single, flickering lantern. She could hear the men shouting to one another out in the yard. struggling to secure the horses against the storm's fury. She did not hesitate. She slipped through the room, a ghost in the dim light, and eased open the heavy front door. A blast of wind and rain hit her, stealing her breath. She had no shoes, no coat, only the thin dress she wore. Barefoot, she ran out into the churning darkness, the cold mud sucking at her feet. Lightning bleached the landscape for a terrifying second, revealing a world of writhing trees and endless, flat land. Then darkness slammed back down, absolute and disorienting. She ran with no sense of direction, guided only by the primal need to put as much distance as possible between herself and that house of death. The thunder masked the sound of her own ragged sobs, and the rain washed the tears from her face. For 2 days, she stumbled through the wilderness. The storm passed, leaving a world washed clean and deceptively beautiful. But it was a deadly beauty. She was lost, alone, and hunted. She knew Silas would send men after her. He would not tolerate the loss of his property. So she hid, moving only in the gray hours of dawn and dusk. She crept through thickets of sagebrush, her heart pounding at the snap of every twig, the call of every distant bird. She found a river, its water brown and swollen from the rain, and drank from it until her stomach ached. The water was her only sustenance. Hunger was a dull, constant ache in her belly, but fear was sharper. She saw a coyote once, its yellow eyes watching her from a ridge, and she froze, making herself as still as a stone until it loped away. She saw horsemen in the distance, tiny figures moving across the plains, and she flattened herself in a shallow ditch, praying the tall grass would hide her until they passed. She did not know if they were Silas's men or simple travelers, and she could not risk finding out. Every man was a potential threat. Her bare feet were a ruin of cuts and bruises. The earth was unforgiving, studded with sharp rocks and thorns. On the 3rd day, utterly exhausted and dizzy with hunger, she made a mistake. Scrambling down a small embankment in the deepening twilight, her foot slipped and she fell headlong into a dense patch of thorn bushes. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her legs. She cried out, a thin, sharp sound that was swallowed by the vast emptiness around her. She tried to pull herself free, but the thorns were like 1,000 tiny fishhooks, tearing at her dress and her skin. Panic seized her. Thrashing only embedded them deeper. Finally, sobbing with pain and frustration, she pulled herself clear, leaving shreds of her dress and pieces of her own flesh behind. Her feet and lower legs were a latticework of bleeding punctures. She stumbled onward, but each step was agony. A strange heat began to spread through her body, a fever born of infection and exhaustion. The world began to tilt and swim before her eyes. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of orange and violet, a beautiful, indifferent spectacle to her suffering. She fell, her knees giving way. The ground was soft and wet from a recent shower, and the cool mud was a small mercy against her burning skin. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs would not obey. The fever was taking hold, whispering strange, disjointed thoughts into her mind. The sky darkened, the stars emerged, cold and distant. She lay there, shivering in the mud, her breath coming in shallow rasps. This is where it ends, she thought, with a strange sense of calm. She had run, but the wilderness had caught her. She closed her eyes, and the world dissolved into blackness. Elias saw the buzzards first, 3 of them, circling high in the morning sky over the eastern edge of his grazing land. It was unusual. He was a man who knew the rhythms of his land, and this was a discordant note. He reined in his horse, Buck, and watched them, his face weathered and lined beneath the brim of his hat, set in a mask of grim suspicion. Trouble, of any kind, was something he avoided. For 5 years. Since the fire, he had cultivated his solitude, building a wall of routine and silence around his grief. He nudged Buck forward, moving not toward the buzzards, but in a wide arc that would give him a better vantage point from the nearby ridge. He was a cautious man. The West did not reward the impulsive. He dismounted at the crest of the ridge and pulled a worn spyglass from his saddlebag. He scanned the area below. It took him a moment to resolve the shape lying near a thicket of brush. It was not a dead calf or a coyote, as he had expected. It was a person, a woman, judging by the tattered remains of a dress. A knot of apprehension tightened in his gut. A lone woman, collapsed on his land, meant a story he did not want to hear. It meant bandits or a broken-down wagon, complications that would shatter the fragile peace of his existence. His first instinct was to ride away, to leave it. It was not his affair. He had his own ghosts. He had no room for anyone else's. But he could not. The buzzards were already descending, their circles tightening. Whatever had happened, leaving her to them was a line he could not cross. With a sigh of weary resignation, he mounted Buck and rode down the slope. As he drew closer, he saw the state she was in. She was lying face down in the mud, her hair matted with dirt and leaves. Her dress was torn to ribbons, and her bare feet and legs were swollen and lacerated, the wounds angry and red. He dismounted and approached her slowly, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. He knelt beside her and gently turned her over. Her face was pale and smudged with dirt, her lips cracked and blue. She was young, younger than he had thought. A girl. Really. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was a faint, thready flutter, but it was there. Her skin was burning with fever. He saw the thorns still embedded in her legs, the clear signs of infection. If she stayed out here, she would be dead by nightfall. He looked around, scanning the empty horizon. There was no one else in sight. No sign of a struggle, no tracks other than her own faltering ones. She was alone, he was alone, and a choice had been laid at his feet. With another sigh, one that seemed to carry the weight of years, he made it. Carefully, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile bundle of bones and fevered flesh. She moaned softly, but did not wake. He carried her to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him, cradling her head against his chest. He turned Buck toward home, toward the small, sturdy cabin that was his fortress against the world, a fortress whose walls were about to be breached. He expected she would recover and leave. It was a temporary mercy, nothing more, a few days, and his life would return to its quiet, predictable solitude. Clara drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark body of water. The first thing she registered was the absence of pain. The searing fire in her feet and legs had been replaced by a dull, heavy throbbing. The second was warmth. A thick wool blanket was tucked around her, and a gentle heat radiated from nearby. The third was the smell, not the metallic tang of blood or the damp scent of earth, but the clean aroma of wood smoke and brewing herbs. She opened her eyes. She was not in the mud. She was in a room, lying on a pallet of soft furs near a stone hearth where a low fire crackled. The room was small and spare, but impeccably clean. The log walls were smooth and well chinked. The wooden floor swept clean. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and shelves holding a few books and tin plates lined one wall. Sunlight streamed through a single, clean glass window. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her head swimming. She looked down at herself. Her torn dress was gone. In its place, she wore a man's linen nightshirt, worn soft with countless washings. It was far too large for her, but it was clean. Her legs were propped on a pillow, her feet and ankles wrapped in clean white bandages. A sound from across the room made her start. A man stood with his back to her, tending a small pot over the fire. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in durable work trousers and a simple cotton shirt. He moved with a quiet economy, his motions deliberate and unhurried as he stirred the contents of the pot. He seemed not to have noticed she was awake. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of her fever. A man, a strange man. She was in his cabin, wearing his shirt. Her breath caught in her throat, and she tried to scramble backward, a small, panicked sound escaping her lips. The man turned. He was not old like Silas, perhaps 30 years of age, with a lean, weathered face that spoke of long hours under the sun. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, and his hair was the color of black coffee. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear gray, and they were filled not with menace, but with a deep, bottomless weariness. A faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a perpetually serious expression. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He made no move toward her. He simply watched her, his gaze steady. He held up a hand, palm out, a gesture meant to soothe a spooked horse. "Easy now," he said. His voice was a low, quiet rumble, like distant thunder. "You're safe." She stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was too weak to run, too weak to fight. She was at his mercy. But as she watched him, she saw the gentleness in his stillness. He did not loom over her. He did not crowd her. He kept his distance, granting her the small space of her palate as if it were sovereign ground. He had undressed her, cleaned her wounds, and bandaged them. He had done this while she was unconscious and helpless. Yet he had not harmed her. The realization was as shocking as it was confusing. He picked up a tin cup from the hearth, poured some of the steaming liquid from the pot into it, and walked slowly toward her. He stopped a few feet away and set the cup down on the floor, well within her reach, but not so close as to force an interaction. "Willow bark tea," he said, "for the fever." He retreated to the other side of the room, turning his attention back to the fire, giving her his back once more. It was a deliberate act of trust, a gesture that granted her a measure of control she had not felt in weeks. She was still afraid, but the terror began to recede, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of wonder. Slowly, she reached for the cup. Her hands trembled as she brought it to her lips. The tea was bitter, but warm, and she drank it gratefully. When she was done, she set the empty cup down and looked at the silent man. He still had not asked her name, or where she had come from, or what had happened to her. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, his gaze on the flames. "You can stay a few days, until your fever breaks and you can walk." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a practical arrangement. A few days. He was not offering charity or a new life, only a temporary reprieve. Clara pulled the wool blanket tighter around her, the simple kindness of it all so foreign that it brought tears to her eyes. As evening fell, he made a simple meal of broth and bread, which they ate in silence. When it was time to sleep, he added another log to the fire and checked her bandages one last time, his touch surprisingly gentle and clinical. He unrolled a bedroll for himself on the floor, a respectful distance away. "The hearth is the warmest spot," he said, gesturing to her pallet. "You take it." He then stood, took a heavy blanket from a wooden chest, and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" she whispered, the first words she had spoken. He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "I'll sleep in the barn loft." He did not wait for a reply. He slipped out into the cool night, closing the door softly behind him. Clara stared at the closed door, listening to the crackle of the fire. He had given her his bed, his home, his food, and now he was giving her the safety and privacy of the entire cabin. He had offered her shelter from the wilderness, and in doing so, had created a different kind of sanctuary. Here, in the home of a silent, scarred stranger. For the first time in a very long time, she felt the possibility of being safe. The first days were a landscape of silence. Clara's world was the pallet by the hearth, and Elias was a quiet, constant presence on its periphery. He would rise before the sun, his movements economical and hushed, and be gone for hours, tending to the needs of a ranch that seemed to consist of only him, a handful of cattle, and a dozen scrawny chickens. He would return for a midday meal, which they ate without speaking. The only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates. Her past was a locked room inside of her, and she had no intention of opening the door. The memories of Silas's house, of the guttural sounds of violence, of the desperate, barefoot flight through the storm, they were a poison she kept carefully contained. To speak of them would be to give them life, to let them loose in this clean, quiet space, and she could not bear the thought of contaminating it. Elias, for his part, never asked. He did not inquire about her name, her family, or the circumstances that had left her half dead in a thorn bush. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the weather, a thing that had arrived and would, in time, depart. He treated her silence not as a void to be filled, but as a boundary to be respected. This quiet consideration was a balm to her frayed spirit. With Silas, every silence had been a threat, a prelude to some new cruelty. With Elias, it was a form of peace. As the fever receded and the strength returned to her limbs, a new kind of stillness settled upon her, the stillness of uselessness. She watched him work, his hands calloused and capable, his body moving with the steady rhythm of a man long accustomed to hard labor. He mended fences, chopped wood, shot his own horse, and moved with a solitary purpose that made her feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. She could not bear to be a burden, another mouth to feed without contribution. One morning, as he prepared to leave for the day, she stood up from her pallet, her bandaged feet still tender. "I can help," she said, her voice thin from disuse. He paused, his hand on the door latch, and looked at her. His gray eyes held no surprise, only a quiet assessment. He gave a single, brief nod toward a bucket near the door. "The chickens need feeding. The grain is in the sack by the stove." And that was how it began. Her first task was simple, almost absurdly so. She took a scoop of grain and walked tentatively out into the bright, sharp air of the yard. The chickens, a flutter of brown and speckled feathers, swarmed around her ankles, their clucking a chaotic chorus. She scattered the grain, and for a few minutes, there was nothing in the world but the pecking of beaks and the warmth of the morning sun on her face. It was a moment of profound, uncomplicated normalcy, and it felt like a miracle. From there, her duties expanded in a slow, unspoken agreement. She learned the rhythms of his ranch, the small, essential tasks that made up a life. She scrubbed the cast-iron stew pot until it shone. She took a worn brush to the dirt-caked tools he brought in from the barn, cleaning and oiling them with methodical care. The repetitive motions were soothing, a way to occupy her hands and quiet her mind. She found a patch of wild herbs growing near the creek and began adding them to the evening stew. Their savory scent a small offering of comfort in their shared silence. Elias accepted her help without comment, but she noticed the small changes. He started leaving the tools on a bench just inside the door for her. Instead of taking them straight to the barn, he left out a slab of bacon in the mornings, a silent invitation for her to cook it. He never touched her. Not once. If he needed to pass her a tool or a plate, he would set it down for her to pick up. If they reached for the same ladle at the stew pot, he would withdraw his hand instantly, yielding the space to her. This careful distance was the foundation upon which a fragile trust began to grow. She had been treated as property, her body something to be grabbed, pulled, and appraised. Elias treated her as if she were made of spun glass, granting her an autonomy over her own person that felt more precious than any jewel. The vast, empty space between them was not filled with awkwardness, but with a profound, unspoken respect that was more intimate than any touch. She began to uncurl from the tight, protective ball she had become. Her shoulders lost some of their permanent hunch. She started to meet his gaze across the dinner table, if only for a fleeting moment. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, she saw him walking toward the back of the barn. He was not carrying any tools or heading for the corral. His pace was different, slower, heavier. Curiosity, a feeling she had not experienced in a long time, nudged her to follow. She slipped out the cabin door and kept to the shadows. Her bare feet now healed into a network of pale pink scars, making no sound on the packed earth. She found him standing near a lone, gnarled oak tree. At its base was a single, simple grave marker, a flat piece of fieldstone that he must have shaped himself. The name carved into it was rough but clear: Mary. Below the name were 2 dates. Elias was not weeping. He simply stood there, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. He was a silhouette of sorrow against the dying light. His shoulders, usually so broad and straight, seemed to sag with a weight she could not comprehend. She felt like an intruder, a witness to a grief so private and profound that her presence was a sacrilege. She started to back away, to retreat to the safety of the cabin, but a floorboard on the side of the barn creaked under her foot. He turned his head. He did not seem startled or angry, only deeply, deeply tired. He looked at her, then back at the stone. Her name was Mary, he said, his voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the evening breeze. She was my fiancée. Clara said nothing. She simply waited, her hands clasped in front of her. There was a fire, he continued, his gaze fixed on the grave as if he could see her there. 5 years ago, the house we were building, over on the south ridge, a lantern overturned. I was in town, getting supplies. By the time I got back, it was too late. He finally turned to face Clara fully, and in the dim light, she saw the raw pain that lived behind the weariness in his eyes. I was supposed to be with her? The confession hung in the air between them, stark and absolute. He had shared the source of his own deep wound, and in that moment, Clara knew that she had to offer a piece of her own. It was a terrifying prospect, but his vulnerability demanded a response. She took a shaky breath. I was sold, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Not wed. He listened, his expression unchanging, his gaze steady. He did not flinch. He did not pity her. He simply listened. I ran away, she added, her voice barely audible. Because I saw a man die, the man who bought me. She couldn't finish. The memory of the thud, of the pleading, broken voice rose in her throat and choked her. Elias held her gaze for a long moment. He did not press for details. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just stood there, a silent witness to her pain, just as she had been to his. He seemed to understand that the truest kindness was not to try and fix what was broken, but simply to acknowledge that it was. The first snow will be here soon, he said, his voice returning to its usual practical tone, though a new softness underscored it. The pass to the next town will be closed until spring. He looked at her, giving her the weight of a decision. You can stay, earn your keep until the thaw, or I can take you to town tomorrow, give you what coin I have for a stagecoach ticket. It was a choice, a real choice, freely given. She could leave, could try to disappear into a new town, a new life, carrying her ghosts with her. Or she could stay here, in this quiet place, with this quiet, grieving man who did not pry. Town meant people, questions, judgment. It meant the constant fear of being recognized, of Silas's reach extending beyond the dusty plains. Here, on this isolated ranch, there was only the wind and the sky and the steady, predictable rhythm of the work. Here, there was Elias. I'll stay, she said, the words coming out stronger than she expected. I want to stay. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. All right then, let's get inside before the chill sets in. The first snow came a week later, not as a gentle dusting, but as a blizzard that descended from the mountains without warning. The world beyond the cabin windows dissolved into a churning vortex of white. For 3 days, they were sealed inside, the howling wind a constant companion. The cabin, which had once felt spare, now seemed like a fortress, a warm, solid bastion against the fury of the storm. The enforced proximity changed things. Silence was no longer possible for hours at a time. They began to talk. It started with practical things, the dwindling woodpile, the stores of flour and salted pork. But as the storm raged on, their conversations drifted. He told her about his father, who had taught him how to read the land and the sky. She told him about her mother, who had loved wildflowers and could name everyone. They were small, careful offerings, fragments of lives lived before the fire, before the sale. One evening, as she was mending one of his shirts by the firelight, her needle slipped and she pricked her finger. A small drop of blood welled up. "Drat," she muttered under her breath. From across the room, where he was oiling a rifle, Elias made a low sound, something between a chuckle and a cough. She looked up, surprised. His lips were quirked in the barest hint of a smile. "My father used to say that a sewing needle had a thirst for blood," he said. A small laugh escaped her, a rusty, unfamiliar sound. "My mother said it was just punishing you for your impatience." They looked at each other, and a genuine shared smile passed between them. It was a small, fragile thing, but in the fire-lit warmth of the cabin, it felt momentous. The great silent wall between them had a crack in it. The winter settled in harshly after that, a deep, abiding cold that froze the creek solid and piled snow in great drifts against the barn. Their lives contracted to the cabin and the daily, necessary trips to care for the livestock. They fell into a comfortable domestic routine. They shared the cooking, the cleaning, the mending. They would sit by the fire in the long evenings, he carving small figures from scraps of wood, she reading from one of the few books on his shelf, a worn copy of Shakespeare, a book on animal husbandry, and a Bible. The physical distance between them remained, a testament to his unwavering respect. He still slept in the cold barn loft, leaving her the warmth and safety of the cabin. But the emotional distance was shrinking with every shared meal, every quiet conversation, every soft laugh. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was Elias, and she, in his eyes, was slowly becoming more than just the desperate woman he had found in the mud. One night, the cold was particularly bitter. A fierce wind found its way through every tiny crack in the cabin walls, and despite the roaring fire, a chill seeped into her bones. She lay on her pallet, huddled under 2 blankets, shivering uncontrollably. Her teeth chattered, a relentless, noisy rhythm in the quiet room. She heard a sound from the doorway and saw that Elias had returned. He must have come back for a warmer blanket. He stood there for a moment, watching her. In the dim light, his face was shadowed and unreadable. He walked not to the chest where the bedding was kept, but to his own horse tack, where a thick, heavy wool blanket, smelling faintly of leather and horse, was folded. He walked over to her pallet. She tensed, expecting him to lay it over her, but he did not. Instead, he laid the folded blanket on the floor beside her pallet, a thick barrier between her and the cold floorboards. Then he went to the chest, took out his own bedroll, and laid it out on the other side of the hearth. He was going to sleep on the floor, in the cabin, but still a careful, respectful distance away. She watched him settle into his bedroll, his back to her. The shivering had begun to subside, the extra layer beneath her already making a difference. But it was not the warmth that filled her. It was the gesture itself, the quiet, profound, unhesitating care of it. "Why?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling. "Why are you kind to me?" He was still for a long moment. She thought perhaps he had not heard her, or would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough murmur, aimed at the fire rather than at her. Because someone should have been. His words, because someone should have been, settled in the quiet cabin and became part of its foundation. They were the mortar that filled the cracks of their shared silence, a quiet truth that bound them together in the deepening winter. The snows came in earnest then, day after day of thick, silent flakes that buried the world in a profound and tranquil white. The path to town disappeared. The distant peaks of the mountains dissolved into the gray sky. The ranch became an island, and they, its sole inhabitants. For Clara, this isolation was not a prison, it was a sanctuary. For the first time since she was a child, she felt a sense of safety so deep it seemed to settle in her bones. The constant, thrumming fear that had been her companion for so long began to recede. She no longer started at the sound of a floorboard creaking or a log shifting in the fire. She moved about the cabin with a growing ease, the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach slowly uncoiling. Elias's presence was a steady, grounding force. He was as predictable as the rising and setting of the winter sun. His quiet dignity a shield against the ghosts that haunted her. But with this newfound safety came a new and complicated emotion. Guilt. It was a sharp, piercing thing that would catch her unawares. She would find herself watching Elias as he mended a piece of leather tack. His brow furrowed in concentration, and a warmth would spread through her chest. A feeling so tender and unfamiliar it frightened her. She was alive. She was warm. She was safe. And she felt these things in the home of a man whose own happiness had burned to ashes. Some afternoons, when the wind was still, she would pull on a heavy coat he had given her and walk to the lone oak tree behind the barn. She would stand before the simple stone marker, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and stare at the name carved there. Mary. This was Mary's home, or what should have been. The stew she cooked was in Mary's pot. The fire she warmed her hands by was in Mary's hearth. And the feelings she was beginning to have for Elias felt like a betrayal. A theft from a woman she had never known. The guilt was a cold stone in her heart, a reminder that this peace she had found was built upon the foundation of another's loss. Elias seemed to sense the shift in her, the way she was poised between healing and retreating into her fear. He understood, in his silent way, that the safety of the cabin was not enough. The world beyond it was still a threat, and for her to truly heal, she needed to know she could face it. One crisp, clear morning, he met her at the cabin door with his rifle in hand. "Come with me," he said, not as a command, but an invitation. He led her to a clearing a short distance from the cabin, where he had set up a row of empty tin cans on a fallen log. He held the rifle out to her. It was a Winchester, its wooden stock worn smooth with use, its steel barrel dark and heavy. She hesitated, the sight of the weapon stirring a primal fear within her. Guns were the tools of men like Silas, instruments of violence and control. "I don't know how," she said, her voice small. "I'll teach you," he replied simply. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. His instructions were practical and direct, his hands never touching her, though he stood close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating from him. He spoke of the rifle not as a weapon of aggression, but as a tool for survival. "Take a breath," he said, his voice calm and low. "Let it out slow, and squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She did as he said. She aimed at the largest can, the cold metal of the trigger a shock against her finger. She squeezed. The rifle exploded against her shoulder with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. The sound of the shot was a deafening crack that echoed off the silent, snow-covered hills. The can remained untouched. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder aching, her ears ringing. But Elias only nodded. "Again," he said. They spent the morning like that. He was a patient teacher, correcting her stance, reminding her to breathe. She fired again and again, the initial shock giving way to a fierce concentration. Finally, with a satisfying ping, one of the cans flew off the log. A triumphant smile broke across her face, involuntary and bright. Elias saw it, and the corner of his mouth quirked upwards in that rare, small smile of his. "Out here," he said, his gray eyes meeting hers, "a woman doesn't need permission to survive." His words settled deep within her. He was not just teaching her to shoot. He was giving her power. He was telling her that she had a right to defend herself, to exist, to fight for her own life. The next lesson was the horse, Buck. His steady gelding was a gentle giant, but Clara was terrified. She had only ever been a passenger on a wagon, never a rider. Elias led the horse into the corral and showed her how to approach him, how to speak in a low, soothing tone. He taught her how to saddle him, her fumbling fingers struggling with the heavy leather straps and buckles. "He can feel your fear," Elias told her. "Trust him, and he'll trust you." Getting into the saddle was an ordeal, but once she was seated, a new perspective of the world opened up to her. She was high above the ground, the horse's strength a living thing beneath her. Elias held the lead rope, walking the horse in slow circles around the corral. At first, she clung to the saddle horn, her body rigid, but gradually, as the horse moved in its steady, rhythmic gait, she began to relax. She felt the power, but also the gentleness of the animal. It was a partnership, a dance of trust. By the end of the week, she was riding on her own inside the corral, and by the end of the month, she was riding alongside Elias as he checked his fence lines, the crisp winter air sharp against her cheeks. The feeling was one of exhilarating freedom. A horse could carry her away. A horse meant she was no longer trapped, no longer dependent on her own 2 feet. Combined with the knowledge of the rifle, it was a revelation. She was not just a victim who had escaped. She was becoming a survivor. Her nights began to change. Too, the frantic, terrifying nightmares of Silas and his dark, suffocating house began to fade, replaced by a different kind of dream. One night, she dreamed she was kneeling in rich, dark earth, planting a row of sunflowers along the fence line of the cabin. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her back and the satisfying ache in her muscles. Another night, she dreamed she was helping Elias build a porch onto the front of the cabin, the scent of fresh sawn pine in the air as they worked side by side. They were dreams not of escape, but of building, not of running, but of staying. They were dreams of a future, a concept she had not dared to entertain. One afternoon, a sound broke the winter silence, the jingle of a harness and the creak of wagon wheels. A traveling trader, a grizzled old man named Phineas, was making his winter rounds, his wagon piled high with goods. He was the first outsider they had seen in months. Phineas was a font of gossip and news from the wider world, his voice loud and grating in the quiet cabin. He and Elias conducted their business, a trade of cured hides for flour, salt, and coffee beans, while Clara stayed by the fire, feeling shy and exposed. "Still up here playing the hermit, are you?" "Elias," Phineas boomed, clapping Elias on the shoulder. "Heard you found yourself some company." He winked crudely at Clara, his eyes lingering on her. "Never thought I'd see the day the widowed ghost on the hill took in a stray." The word struck Clara like a physical blow. The widowed ghost on the hill. She saw Elias's jaw tighten, his face hardening into a familiar stoic mask. He ignored the comment, finishing the trade with a terse efficiency and seeing Phineas on his way. But the trader's words lingered in the air long after he was gone. Clara looked at Elias, a new understanding dawning in her. She had seen him only as her rescuer, a man of quiet strength and deep sadness. She had never considered how the rest of the world saw him. They saw a man haunted, broken, defined only by his tragedy. They had judged him, dismissed him, and turned him into a piece of local folklore. She realized then that they were not so different. They were both outcasts, branded by their pasts, living on the fringes of a world that did not understand their pain. Her empathy for him deepened, solidifying into a fierce, protective loyalty. Christmas arrived without fanfare. The day dawned cold and bright. The world outside blanketed in a fresh layer of snow that glittered in the sun. There was no church, no gathering, just the two of them in the small, warm cabin. That morning, after they had tended to the animals, Clara shyly held out a small, wrapped package to Elias. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. He looked surprised, as if the holiday had passed him by unnoticed for years. He took the package and opened it. Inside was a simple cotton kerchief, but she had spent weeks secretly stitching his initial, a large, handsome, into one corner with dark blue thread. It was a small, humble thing, but it was all she had to give. He ran his thumb over the stitching, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not name. He then reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small object, which he pressed into her hand. It was a ring carved from a piece of dark, smooth wood, polished until it shone. It was not a perfect circle, but it was made with an unmistakable care and artistry. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It was not a ring of gold or silver, not a promise of marriage, but it felt more precious than any jewel. It was a piece of his land, his time, his thought. It was a quiet acknowledgement of her, a symbol that she belonged here, in this moment. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time they were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a profound and overwhelming gratitude. The bond forged that day was tested not long after. The nightmares, though less frequent, had not vanished entirely. One night, she was wrenched from sleep by a dream so vivid it felt real. She was back in Silas's house, locked in the dark room, the sound of his footsteps approaching in the hall. She woke up with a strangled cry, her heart hammering against her ribs, the cold sweat of terror clinging to her skin. The shadows of the cabin seemed to press in on her, twisting into menacing shapes. Elias was awake instantly, sitting up in his bedroll across the hearth. "Clara?" he asked, his voice low and calm. She could not speak. She was shaking, caught in the grip of a panic so absolute she could not separate the dream from reality. Without thinking, without conscious thought, she reached out her hand across the space between them, a desperate, silent plea for an anchor in the terrifying darkness. He did not hesitate. He moved from his bedroll to kneel beside her pallet. He took her trembling hand in his. His hand was large, calloused, and wonderfully solid. He did not say anything. He did not try to soothe her with words. He simply held her hand, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles, his presence a steady, unwavering warmth in the cold, dark room. It was the first time they had touched with such intention, a direct physical connection that was not accidental or for the purpose of a lesson. It was an act of pure comfort, of shared humanity. She clung to his hand as a drowning woman clings to a rope, and slowly, the frantic beating of her heart began to slow. The shadows receded. She was not in Silas's house. She was in the cabin. She was safe. Elias was here. She did not let go of his hand until the first pale light of dawn crept through the window. The deep snows of winter finally began to recede, giving way to the mud and melt of a false spring. The world was awakening, and with it, the threat of the world beyond their sanctuary. The inevitable arrived on a gray, overcast afternoon in the form of a lone rider. He was a young man with a tin star pinned to his coat, a deputy from the nearest town. Elias met him on the porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway, a silent barrier. Clara watched from the shadows of the window, her blood turning to ice in her veins. "Afternoon," the deputy said, nodding to Elias. "Name's Miller. Just doing the rounds. Looking for a runaway? A young woman." He unrolled a piece of paper, even from a distance. Clara could see the crude drawing of a woman's face and the large, bold letters of her own name, a wanted poster. "Goes by the name of Clara," the deputy continued, reading from the poster, Took off from her husband, a Mr. Silas Croft, a few months back. He's filed a legal claim for her return. Says she stole a locket and some money, offering a reward. A lie, a cruel, vicious lie that twisted her escape into a crime. Silas was using the law as his weapon, painting her as a common thief to legitimize his hunt. Elias looked at the poster, his face a granite mask. He showed no flicker of recognition, no hint of surprise. He looked from the paper to the deputy, his gray eyes cold as a winter river. "Never seen her," he said, his voice flat and final. "No one's been through here all winter." The deputy studied him for a long moment, his gaze shifting from Elias's impassive face to the small, well-kept cabin behind him. "You sure about that? He's a powerful man. Mr. Croft, be a lot easier on you if you cooperated." "I said," Elias repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "I don't recognize the woman." There was a finality in his tone that allowed for no further argument. The deputy, young and out of his depth, seemed to recognize he was facing a wall he could not breach. With a frustrated sigh, he rolled up the poster, tipped his hat, and rode away, swallowed by the gray landscape. Elias stood on the porch for a long time, watching until the rider was a mere speck in the distance. When he finally came back inside, he found Clara leaning against the wall, her face ashen. He had lied to a lawman. He had defied a powerful man. He had knowingly and willingly placed himself in danger. All for her. The sheer weight of his loyalty, the immense cost of his quiet declaration that she was his to protect, was too much to bear. A single sob broke from her lips, then another. The tears she had held back for months finally came, a flood of fear and relief, and a gratitude so profound it felt like an ache in her soul. She wept, not for the danger they were now in, but for the man who had chosen to stand with her in it. The deputy's departure left a silence in the cabin that was heavier and more suffocating than any snowstorm. The flimsy wanted poster, though gone, had left an indelible mark, a poison that seeped into the safe space they had built. Clara stood frozen, the echo of Elias's lie to a lawman ringing in her ears. He had chained himself to her fate, and the weight of that chain was crushing her. She moved then, a sudden, frantic energy seizing her. She went to the small chest where the few items of clothing Elias had given her were kept. A simple wool skirt, 2 sturdy shirts. She began to fold them, her movements jerky and desperate. "I have to go," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. She did not look at him. She could not bear to see the consequence of her presence in his eyes. "He knows where I am now. He will send more men. They will hurt you because of me." Elias did not move from the center of the room. He simply stood there, a solid, immovable object in the swirl of her panic. "And where will you go, Clara? Back into the wilderness, to freeze or starve before you've gone 10 miles? "It doesn't matter," she insisted, tears blurring her vision as she fumbled with a shirt. "I will not be the reason you are harmed. I will not bring Silas's violence to your door. You saved me. Let that be the end of it. Don't let me be the cause of your ruin." She bundled the clothes into a small, pathetic pile. "You have your own ghost to live with. You don't need mine, too." She turned to face him then, ready to plead, to beg him to let her leave. But the look on his face stopped her cold. It was not anger, or pity, or fear. It was a fierce, blazing intensity she had never seen before. A fire that burned away the weariness and left something hard and unyielding in its place. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and gently but firmly took the bundle of clothes from her hands. He set them on the table. "You are not a burden," he said, his voice low and resonant, each word striking her like a hammer blow. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away. "For 5 years, I have done nothing but exist. I have worked this land, I have eaten, I have slept, but I have not lived. I have been fighting ghosts that are already buried." He paused, his gray eyes holding hers with a raw honesty that stripped her bare. You are the first reason I have had to fight again. The first reason to face the world as it is, not as it was. Her tears, which had been born of fear, now flowed from a place of stunned, aching confusion. She did not understand. She was damaged, hunted, a source of trouble and shame. Running is not a plan, he continued, his tone shifting to one of hard, practical logic. Men like Silas do not give up. He considers you as property. He will hunt you to the ends of the earth, not because he wants you, but because he cannot tolerate being defied. The only way to be free of him is to face him, to break his power over you for good. How? She whispered, the word a fragile puff of air. He has the law on his side. He has money. He has men. I am nothing. You are not nothing, Elias stated, his conviction absolute. You are a witness. You saw him kill a man. His claim on you is built on a lie. The truth is your weapon. It's the only one we have. The idea was terrifying. A leap into an abyss. To go to town, to stand before strangers and speak of the horrors she had endured. To accuse a powerful man of murder. It seemed impossible. But as she looked at Elias, at the unshakable belief in his face, a tiny, flickering ember of courage began to glow within her. He was not asking her to be strong. He was offering her his strength to lean on. We will go to town together, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. We will go to the magistrate. You will tell him what you saw. You will clear your name. The journey to town was a silent one, fraught with a tension that was thicker than the morning mist rising from the thawing earth. They rode side by side, Elias on Buck and Clara on a quieter, older mare from his small herd. She wore the wooden ring he had carved for her, turning it over and over on her finger, its smooth surface a small, solid comfort. The world felt vast and threatening, and the small town, nestled in a valley ahead, seemed less like a destination of hope and more like the site of a final, desperate battle. The town of Redemption was little more than a single, mud-churned street lined with squat, false-fronted buildings. As they rode in, heads turned, faces appeared in windows. Men stopped their conversations to watch them pass, their gazes lingering on Clara with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The story of the wanted poster and the deputy's visit had clearly made the rounds. She was already a piece of gossip, a scandalous curiosity. She pulled the collar of her coat up, wishing she could disappear. The magistrate's office was also the town saloon. A makeshift courtroom had been set up in a corner, a rickety table serving as the judge's bench. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies. A dozen or so townspeople had already gathered, drawn by the promise of a spectacle. Elias led her through the small crowd, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. A warm, reassuring presence that did not feel like a violation, but a shield. He spoke in a low voice to the magistrate, an old, sour-faced man named Judge Miller. The judge looked Clara up and down, his expression one of weary disdain, but he agreed to hear her testimony. The trial, if it could be called that, was brutal from the start. As Clara walked to the front of the room to be sworn in, a low murmur rippled through the crowd. She could hear snippets of conversation, cruel whispers that cut her like shards of glass. That's the one Elias has been hiding up on his hill. Doesn't look like much. Wonder what he sees in her. Silas Croft's runaway. Heard she stole from him. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She felt utterly alone, a specimen under the collective, judgmental gaze of the town. Then, she saw a flicker of movement. A woman, sitting in the front row, gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. She was the schoolteacher, a woman named Abigail Martin, known for her stern demeanor and her refusal to be intimidated by the town's rougher elements. The gesture was small, but it was a lifeline. It was a silent message that not everyone here was her enemy. Clara took a deep, shuddering breath and began to speak. Her voice, at first, was a choked whisper. The judge had to ask her to speak up. She looked at Elias, who stood against the back wall, his arms crossed, his face a calm, steady beacon in the hostile sea of faces. She drew strength from him and started again. Through shaking lips, she told her story. She told them about her uncle, about being sold for a pouch of coins. She described the dark, forbidding house, the constant presence of the guards, the feeling of being a prisoner. She spoke of the fear, the isolation, the chilling way Silas would look at her, as if she were a thing he owned. As she spoke, the room grew quiet, the whispers dying down. She detailed the events of that final afternoon, the sounds of the argument, the sickening thuds of the blows, the young man's pleading cries. She did not spare them the horror of it. She made them hear what she had heard. "I saw him," she said, her voice finally gaining strength, fueled by the memory of the injustice. "I saw Silas Croft take a man's life, and I knew that he would do the same to me if I ever displeased him. So I ran. I did not steal anything. I ran for my life." When she finished, a profound silence filled the room. She looked out at the faces before her. Some of the men were smirking, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and crude amusement. But some of the women, the ones who knew what it was to feel powerless, had tears tracking through the dust on their cheeks. The swinging doors of the saloon burst open, and a cold draft swept through the room. Silas Croft stood there, framed in the doorway. He was not alone. Flanked by two well-dressed, imposing men, he exuded an aura of wealth and untouchable power. He surveyed the room, his dark eyes landing on Clara. A slow, contemptuous sneer spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice a gravelly boom that filled the room. "It seems my little runaway has learned how to tell stories." He strode into the room as if he owned it, his allies following close behind. He stopped before the judge's table, ignoring Clara completely. "Judge Miller, I apologize for this interruption to your day. This is a private matter, a simple domestic dispute. My betrothed is a fanciful girl, prone to hysterics." He finally turned to look at Clara, his gaze sweeping over her with a calculated insult. "Look at her, filthy, dressed in rags. She has been living with him," he said, gesturing contemptuously toward Elias. "She is used goods, unfit for marriage, unfit for decent society. She has spun this wild tale of murder to cover her own shame and thievery." The words were designed to destroy her. In this world, a woman's reputation was everything, and he had just publicly branded her as a fallen woman, a liar, and a thief. The men in the crowd snickered openly now. Clara felt a wave of nausea and shame so powerful it threatened to buckle her knees. She had done this for nothing. They would never believe her. She was ruined. But then, a voice, calm and clear, cut through the ugly atmosphere. "She's more wife than most men deserve." It was Elias. He had pushed himself off the back wall and had taken a step forward. He was breaking every rule of the informal court, speaking out of turn. But he did not care. All eyes swung to him. The room was utterly silent. He looked directly at Silas, his gray eyes blazing with a cold fire. "You call her unfit? A man who buys a woman like she's a head of cattle, who locks her away and terrorizes her. Who thinks his coin gives him the right to own a human soul? You're the one who is unfit to speak her name." He then turned his gaze to the rest of the room, his voice ringing with an authority that had nothing to do with money or power, but with simple, unshakable conviction. "This woman is not a thief. She is a survivor, and what she has told you is the truth." The silence that followed was absolute. No one dared to snicker now. Elias's words, spoken with such quiet, powerful dignity, had shifted the very air in the room. He had not only defended her, he had publicly declared his allegiance to her, his belief in her, his respect for her. He had taken her shame and thrown it back in Silas's face. Judge Miller, the old man who had seen the worst of men in war and on the frontier, looked from Silas's furious, sneering face to Clara's tear-streaked but resolute one. He looked at Elias, standing tall and unwavering. He picked up his gavel, a simple wooden mallet, and banged it once on the table. The sound was like the crack of a rifle. "I have heard enough," he said, his voice the rasp of old leather. "The testimony of this woman," he said, pointing a gnarled finger at Clara, "is credible. Silas Croft, I am ordering you detained pending a full investigation into the death of your hired man." A gasp went through the crowd. Silas's face contorted with rage and disbelief. His powerful friends began to protest, but the judge slammed his gavel down again. "Detained. Deputy, take him into custody." The young deputy, looking both terrified and emboldened, stepped forward and took Silas by the arm. For the first time, Clara saw a flicker of fear in Silas's eyes. His power was not absolute. It could be broken. Clara walked out of the saloon into the gray afternoon light, her legs unsteady. She was legally free, at least for now, but she did not feel victorious. She felt raw, exposed, and utterly exhausted. The stares of the townspeople followed her, no longer just curious, but filled with a new mixture of pity, awe, and hatred. She was no longer just a runaway. She was the woman who had brought down Silas Croft. She did not know if she was free or just more hated. A warm, heavy weight settled around her shoulders. It was Elias. He had taken off his thick wool coat and wrapped it around her, shielding her from the cold and the prying eyes. She leaned into him, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of wood smoke, leather, and him. He guided her toward the horses, his arm a solid, protective presence. He did not say, "We won't or it's over." He leaned down, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "You were braver than anyone in that room." The ride back to the ranch was a journey through a landscape of profound silence. The legal victory in town felt less like a triumph and more like the grim conclusion of a necessary amputation. The source of the rot had been cut away, but the wound remained, raw and exposed. Elias's coat was a heavy, warm shield around Clara's shoulders, yet it could not protect her from the chill that had settled deep within her soul. Silas's words echoed in her mind, a vicious, looping refrain. Used goods, unfit for marriage. They were brands, seared onto her spirit, invisible to the eye but felt with every beat of her heart. They reached the cabin as the sun began its descent, painting the snow-patched plains in hues of soft pink and bruised purple, the quiet of the homestead, which had once been a source of profound comfort, now felt like an empty, echoing chamber for her shame. Elias moved with his usual deliberate grace, unsaddling the horses, his silence a familiar and welcome presence. He did not press her to speak. He seemed to understand that the battle she had just fought had left her with no words. Inside, he built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, a bulwark against the coming night. He made a simple broth, and they ate in their accustomed quiet. But the quality of the silence had changed. Before, it had been a space of healing and growing trust. Now, it was filled with the unspoken ugliness of the trial. Clara felt like a contaminant in this clean, simple home. She felt the filth of the town's judgment clinging to her, a stain that soap and water could not wash away. In the days that followed, a fragile, tense version of their old routine returned. She did her chores, feeding the chickens, cleaning the cabin, mending clothes, but her movements were listless, her gaze distant. The legal victory had not erased her past, it had only made it public. She had been declared a free woman by the law, but in the court of public opinion, the verdict was still out. She was no longer just Silas's runaway. She was a story, a piece of gossip to be picked over and embellished by the townsfolk. A week later, Elias rode into town for supplies. It was the first time one of them had gone back since the hearing. He went alone, insisting that she stay. "No need for both of us to endure it," was all he said. He was gone longer than usual. When he returned late in the afternoon, She saw a new hardness in the set of his jaw. He unloaded the sacks of flour and coffee beans with a grim efficiency, his movements tight with a contained anger. He did not speak of what had happened in town, and she did not ask. She did not need to. She could read the story in the way he avoided her eyes, in the coiled tension in his shoulders. She knew he had faced the whispers, the stares, the judgment of the town on her behalf. The whispers found their way to the ranch a few days later, in the person of Reverend Blackwood. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that burned with a cold, righteous fire. He rode up to the cabin uninvited, his black coat a stark blot against the muted colors of the landscape. Elias met him on the porch, his body a silent, formidable barrier in the doorway. Clara watched from the window, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. "I have come on a matter of spiritual urgency," the preacher announced, his voice carrying a tone of pious authority. He did not look at Elias, but past him, into the cabin, as if he could see the stain of sin on the very walls. "The woman, Clara. The town is in an uproar. Her reputation is in tatters. A soul in such a state of public disgrace is a danger to the entire community." "That's her name," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What's your business with her?" "My business is with the Lord's flock," the preacher said, puffing out his chest. "I have come to offer her a path back to decency, a chance to cleanse her reputation." He paused for dramatic effect. "I am prepared to perform a purity ritual, a public baptism in the river, a testimony of repentance before the congregation. It is the only way for her to be accepted back into the fold of respectable society, the only way she might ever hope to be seen as a worthy bride for a decent man." The offer hung in the cold air, an act of profound and sanctimonious cruelty. He was not offering salvation. He was offering a spectacle. He wanted to put her shame on public display, to make her penance a form of entertainment for the very people who judged her. Elias was perfectly still for a long moment. The coiled energy in him was palpable. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was as sharp and final as the crack of a whip. "Get off my land." The preacher blinked, taken aback. "Sir, I am offering this woman a chance at redemption." "You are offering her nothing but your own misplaced pride and the town's ugly judgment," Elias cut in, his voice dropping lower, colder. "Her soul is not your concern, and her worth is not for you, or any of them, to decide." He took a single, deliberate step forward. "I will not say it again." There was no mistaking the threat in his posture, the absolute finality in his tone. The preacher, for all his moral authority, was a coward at heart. He sputtered for a moment, then gathered his reins, shot a look of pure venom toward the cabin, and rode away, his dignity in tatters. Elias came back inside, his face a thundercloud. He went to the hearth and stared into the flames, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. Clara stood by the table, shaking. The preacher's words had flayed her open, confirming her deepest fears. She was unclean, unworthy, a pariah. "He is right," she whispered, the words tearing from her throat. "That is how they see me. That is what I am." Elias turned from the fire, his face etched with a fierce, protective anger. "I don't care what they think," he said, his voice rough. "Their judgment is worth less than the dust on my boots. Do you hear me, Clara? It means nothing." He crossed the room and stood before her. He did not touch her, but his presence was an overwhelming force of reassurance. He looked at her, and his eyes were not filled with pity, but with a powerful, unwavering belief that seemed to pour strength directly into her. He saw her, not the ruined woman the world saw, but the survivor he knew her to be. His conviction gave her the courage to ask the question that had been festering in her heart, the question that held all of her shame and all of her hope. She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, her voice barely a whisper. "Can I still be a bride?" The question was a raw, vulnerable thing, laid bare between them. It was not just about a wedding, a white dress, a title. It was about worthiness, about wholeness, about the possibility of a future that was not defined by what had been done to her. It was about whether a woman who had been sold and broken could ever be seen as precious again. Elias's fierce expression softened. A look of profound tenderness washed over his face. He reached out, and for the first time, he cupped her cheek in his hand, his calloused thumb gently stroking her skin. There was no hesitation, no flicker of doubt in his clear gray eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He leaned his forehead against hers, a gesture of absolute intimacy. "Because I saved you first, and you saved me after." His words were a revelation. He was not just her rescuer. She had been his. She had pulled him from the gray, silent fog of his grief, from the lonely existence of the widowed ghost on the hill. She had not been a burden. She had been a reason. In that moment, he did not just heal her deepest wound. He declared them equals, partners in a shared salvation. That night, the unspoken walls that had stood between them for so long finally crumbled into dust. After their silent dinner, as Elias banked the fire and prepared to unroll his bedroll on the floor, Clara stood up from the table. Her heart was a wild, frantic bird in her chest, but for the first time, it was a fluttering of courage, not fear. She walked across the room to where he stood. He looked up, his expression questioning. She did not speak. She did not need to. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. She could feel its steady, solid beat beneath her palm. This was not an act of fear, or pity, or gratitude. It was an act of pure, unadorned desire, a reclamation of a part of herself she thought had been destroyed forever. It was a choice, made freely and with a heart full of a love she was only just beginning to understand. He looked down into her eyes, and in their depths, he saw not a victim, but a woman, strong and whole and choosing him. He slowly raised his hands and placed them on her waist, his touch a reverent question. She leaned into him, a silent answer. Their union was not the stuff of hurried, fumbling passion. It was a slow, tender exploration, a fierce and sacred act of healing. In his arms, in the warm, fire-lit cabin. She was not Silas's property or the town's fallen woman. She was Clara, and he was not the widowed ghost, but Elias. They shed their pasts like old, worn-out skins, and in the quiet, uncharted territory of their embrace, they found not just solace, but a new and breathtaking home. A few days later, while cleaning and airing out the contents of an old wooden trunk at the foot of Elias's bed, Clara's hands brushed against a carefully wrapped bundle of oilcloth. She knew, with a sudden, painful certainty, what it was before she even opened it. Inside, preserved against the damp and dust, was a wedding dress. It was made of simple, cream-colored linen, with delicate lacework at the collar and cuffs. Mary's dress. She lifted it from the trunk. It was beautiful, imbued with the hopes and dreams of a woman she would never know. For a moment, she felt that old, familiar guilt. She was an imposter, a usurper in this house, in this life. She should put it back, bury it in the trunk, and forget she had ever seen it. But then she thought of Elias's words. "You saved me after." She was not replacing Mary. She was starting something new. She took the dress to the table and laid it out. It was a little too long, the sleeves a bit too full. She looked at it for a long time, then went to her small sewing kit. With a steady hand, she picked up the shears. She did not destroy the dress. She altered it. She shortened the hem, took in the waist, and removed the high lace collar, giving it a simpler, more open neckline that felt more like her. She found a spool of pale blue thread, the color of a winter sky at dawn, and added a simple line of embroidery along the cuffs. She worked for 2 days, and when she was finished, it was no longer Mary's dress. It was her own, It carried the memory of the past, but it was tailored to fit her future. On a mild evening, as the setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the land, they stood together under the lone oak tree. The air was still, the world quiet. Clara wore the altered dress, the wooden ring on her finger. Elias wore a clean shirt, his dark hair combed back from his face. There was no preacher, no witnesses, only the land that had borne silent witness to all of their sorrow and all of their joy. He took both of her hands in his. They were not the hands of a soft town woman. They were capable, scarred, and strong, just like hers. "I have no gold to give you," he said, his voice a low, solemn vow in the quiet air. "Only this land, and my name, and a promise to stand by you for all the days I have left." "It is more than I have ever dreamed of," she whispered, her heart full to bursting. They stood in silence for a moment, man and wife, bound by a promise that was deeper than any law or sermon. As they turned to walk back to the small cabin that was now, finally, truly their home, Elias stopped and looked down at her, a rare, full smile transforming his weary face. "Mary and I," he said, his voice soft. "We were children making plans for a life we thought we understood." He squeezed her hand, his gaze holding hers with a lifetime of meaning. "You, Clara, you're the first woman I've ever truly married." The marriage forged under the oak tree was not the end of their story, but the beginning of their life. The quiet of the ranch remained, but it was a different kind of quiet now, one filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with the shared, unspoken language of a future being built. The change in Clara was gradual, but profound. The hunted look left her eyes, replaced by a calm, steady light. She moved with a new purpose, her steps sure and confident on the land that was now her own. Elias had a small, precious collection of books kept in a wooden crate, the Bible, a well-thumbed volume of Shakespeare, and a few practical manuals on agriculture and animal husbandry. One afternoon, Clara was reading by the fire when a thought, bold and clear, took root in her mind. A few days later, she rode the mare to the two nearest homesteads, small, struggling ranches miles apart, and spoke to the mothers there. And so, twice a week, the quiet of the cabin was broken by the sound of young voices. 3 girls, ranging in age from 7 to 12, would arrive, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes wide with a mixture of shyness and curiosity. Their parents, weary and unlettered themselves, wanted a better chance for their daughters, and they saw in Clara a quiet strength they could trust. Using the Bible for its simple prose and Shakespeare for the music of its language, Clara began to teach them their letters. She was a patient and intuitive teacher. She understood that learning was not just about memorizing the alphabet. It was about opening a door to a wider world. She would sit with them at the long wooden table, her head bent close to theirs, guiding their small, clumsy fingers as they formed the letters with lumps of charcoal on pieces of smoothed bark. Elias would often come in from his work and stand in the doorway, a silent, watchful guardian, a rare, soft smile touching his lips as he listened to the clumsy, beautiful sound of his wife teaching children how to read in the home he had once thought would forever be empty. The coming of spring meant the road to town was clear. The first time Clara rode into redemption at Elias's side, she felt the familiar, cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She wore her simple wool skirt and a clean shirt, her hair braided neatly down her back. She did not look like a woman of importance, but she held her head high, her eyes fixed forward, just as Elias had taught her. The whispers followed them down the main street, a rustling, invisible tide of gossip. But something was different this time. The stares were still there, but they were less hostile, more curious. Some of the mockery had been replaced by a grudging respect. She saw the schoolteacher, Abigail Martin, who was sweeping the steps of the schoolhouse. Abigail stopped her work, looked directly at Clara, and gave her a firm, clear nod of acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but in the public theater of the small town, it was a declaration. A few other women, seeing the teacher's sign of approval, offered hesitant smiles. The biggest news in town, however, was about Silas Croft. The investigation, spurred by Clara's testimony, had unearthed a long history of violence, intimidation, and illegal dealings. Other men, emboldened by his fall from grace, had come forward with their own stories. He was found guilty, not just of the murder of his hired man, but of a litany of other crimes that would see him locked away for the rest of his life. The final chapter of his story came a month later, delivered by a passing cattle driver. Silas Croft was dead. He had been found in his cell. The official cause of death listed as a fever, but the rumors told a different story. They spoke of a quiet, methodical revenge taken by the family of a man he had cheated years ago, of a guard paid to look the other way. The whispers swirled, but no one seemed overly concerned with the truth of it. A dark presence had been lifted from the territory, and few were inclined to mourn its passing. When Elias told her the news, Clara felt nothing. There was no joy, no triumph, no satisfaction. His death did not erase the scars he had left on her soul. It was simply the closing of a door, a final, quiet click that sealed the past away for good. She said nothing, her silence a testament to the fact that her peace was no longer tied to his fate. She had found her own redemption, not in his death, but in the life she was building. That summer, a new sheriff arrived in Redemption. The old, weary judge had retired, and the town, in a moment of collective optimism, had elected a younger man named Thomas Riley. He was a former soldier, quiet and thoughtful, with a keen sense of justice and a deep weariness of the casual brutality that so often defined life on the frontier. One afternoon, he rode out to the ranch. Clara and Elias met him on the porch they had recently added to the cabin, a small testament to their shared dreams of building, not just surviving. Mrs. Murdoch," the sheriff said, politely removing his hat. "Mr. Murdoch." He came straight to the point. "I've been thinking about your testimony, about what happened to you, and I know you're not the only one. There are other women, other girls, who find themselves in desperate situations, with nowhere to turn." He looked directly at Clara, his gaze filled with a sincere respect. "The town council has given me a small budget to secure a property, an old boarding house at the edge of town. I want to turn it into a safe house, a place where a woman can go and be safe, where she can get a meal and a bed and some help moving on. But I don't know how to run such a place. It needs a woman's guidance, someone who understands." He paused. "I was hoping you would help me build it, help me decide how it should be run." Clara looked at Elias. He gave her a single, steady nod. His eyes said everything. "This is your choice, and I will stand with you." She turned back to the young sheriff, a sense of purpose settling over her like a warm cloak. Her past was not a source of shame. It was a source of strength, of knowledge. It had uniquely prepared her for this. "Yes, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I will help you." The next year was one of relentless, joyful work. Elias, with a small profit from a good cattle sale, bought the adjacent parcel of land, doubling the size of their ranch. He built new fences, his hammer blows echoing across the valley in a steady, life-affirming rhythm. He was no longer a ghost on a hill. He was a rancher, a husband, a man building a future. Clara, in turn, oversaw the transformation of the dilapidated boarding house. She drew up plans, not just for walls and rooms, but for a place of healing. She insisted on a large, communal kitchen, a reading room with comfortable chairs, and a small garden in the back. The project became a focus for the better nature of the town. Abigail Martin, the school teacher, organized the other women to sew curtains and collect donations of bedding and furniture. Even some of the men who had once snickered at her in the saloon now found themselves volunteering their time. hammering nails and plastering walls under her quiet, determined direction. They no longer saw her as Silas Crofts' runaway. They saw her as Mrs. Murdoch, the woman who was building the safe house, the woman who was teaching their children to read. As the safe house neared completion, Clara turned her attention back to the ranch. Her small group of students had grown. Word had spread. And now nearly a dozen children from the surrounding homesteads made the trek to the ranch for their lessons. The small cabin could no longer contain them. "We need a schoolhouse," she told Elias one evening. And so they built one on a small, flat piece of land not far from the cabin. They laid a foundation. Elias, with the help of a few neighbors who now called him a friend, raised the frame. Clara, with the help of the women, chinked the walls and painted the interior a bright, cheerful white. It was a simple, one-room structure, but to Clara, it was more beautiful than any cathedral. It was a house of hope, a testament to the idea that a better world could be built, right here, in the middle of the unforgiving wilderness. One evening, as the last of the summer light faded from the sky, they were sitting on their new